Hi, and welcome to London Lights, the show where we focus on notable Londoners who had made a big impact on the world of music, entertainment, sports, politics. And today, I'm very pleased to have as a guest the one and only Jim Chapman. Jim, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Dan. One and only. I'm not sure about that, but I guess.
Well, it's good to see you, Jim. Before we get started, I want to just review your resume here real quick. You're a former teen idol, it says.
Well, yeah, sure, whatever.
A professional musician.
Publicity guys, Dan. You go with whatever they say, you know.
A professional musician, recording studio owner, ad agency owner, first person in London media to have a local radio show, TV show, newspaper column, and magazine column at the same time. Communications consultant, author of 8 books, owner of a book publishing company, composer of 3 albums and dozens of songs, collector of vintage musical equipment, old car fan and owner, and last but not least, lives with your wife of 41 years, Carlin. Is that right?
Yeah,
Carolyn?
she must have written that.
2 cats and 2 dogs.
Yeah.
But again, a man that needs no introduction. Welcome, Jim. How you been doing?
Well, like everybody else, I wish this was over, but we've adapted. You know, my wife and I are both in the high risk category, so we've been very careful. But it is what it is, and life goes on. You make the most of it.
Right on. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the London music scene in the 1960s. You were part of that. Looking forward to chatting with you about that. But as an introduction, I just wanted to mention we just did an interview with Professor Rob Bowman on the band.
Oh, yeah.
And we talked about Robbie Robertson's book. One of the things he says is that in the 1960s, London was a very musical town. It had been from the 19th century, and it was a big jazz town in the 1950s, and then a big rock and roll town in the 1960s. Is that true?
Yeah, pretty much. And you go back to the days and before, but back to the Lombardos, you know, shortly after the turn of the 20th century. They're sort of representative, indicative of the kind of music scene that was here. There was great players, lots of places to play, lots of great bands. And then as the years went by, London remained very active because of that core of musicians that had grown up, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century. Get into the 50s, and yeah, jazz came along, and that's before my time, but I do know or did know some of the guys from that period of time. They were all past, all the ones that I knew well past now, but I had an opportunity to talk to some of them about what the scene was like then. And then the late 50s, rock and roll started to rear its ugly head. There were a couple of bands actually, about more than that, but the Dewdrops was one, and the Crown Imperials, and bands like that generally owed a lot to Buddy Holly. Not all of them, but they had that sort of Texas rock thing kind of going on there. And then in the early 60s, more of the younger guys my age now, because that group was a generation, half a generation older than me, the early rock and roll guys. But guys my age came of age in the early to mid 60s then. Boom, just an unbelievable explosion as it was all around the world. Rock and roll suddenly went from being a slightly rebellious music that your parents probably didn't like to still rebellious music. You still had the Stones and groups like that, but it became a much bigger part of our lives. And I'm talking about my generation than the guys maybe half generation earlier than me. Most of those guys were working stiffs who played on the side. When my generation came along, at least for 7 or 8 years there, a lot of the young musicians, that's all they did. They didn't have jobs. They concentrated on the music. So that made for a very lively marketplace here. A lot of creativity, a lot of creative things going on. And key for any band, you know yourself as a performer, it's the audience, right? You can sit in your basement for the rest of your life and become the greatest musician the world has ever seen, and you will still not have had that experience of being in front of a live audience and getting the feedback with them. And there's nothing in the world like that. And there was lots and lots of work. So the bands had a real opportunity to get as good as they were capable of becoming.
Jim, as we prepared for this show, we had some pre-show chat, and you said something to me that's stuck with me, and I've been thinking it over and over. In so many of these shows I'm doing, it's the Beatles that are really the impetus, the beginning, the kind of this nuclear explosion that happens and creates this wonderful rock and roll, guitar-driven uh, mop top scene. Um, and you mentioned that there was a time you had some involvement with John Ballone's, and with John Bellone, when the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, somebody saw kids are going to start picking up guitars, and this is the time to get into the guitar selling business. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I knew John from when he first arrived in London in 1963. He came here to open a branch for a music company in Hamilton called Pilgrim. And I don't know the exact time level, but a very few months later, he bought them out. They bought it. I don't know whatever happened, but the sign on the store was John Bellone. And John was a very interesting man, a dear friend of mine for more than 50 years. John was a very astute businessman. And he saw, he wasn't alone in the scene. This Jack Long from Long McQuaid's had a similar epiphany. And they were friends, incidentally, very good friends. But he saw that there was going to be a whole new market here. It wasn't just going to be the older, the guy who worked at the plant all week long and then played on the weekend. He's already got his guitar. He's already got his amp. His career's going nowhere other than he's having fun, which is fabulous. There's nothing wrong with that. But he's not likely going to come in and buy another guitar. And he's just not going to do that. But the kids will spend every penny that they can earn, borrow, cajole out of the old man and the old lady, all of those things that we did to try to get started. And John was wise enough to see that that was a potentially ginormous market. And he catered to the kids. The other big music store in town in those days, I won't mention its name, and I'm not related to them, but they were, most of your listeners, I'm sure, will know that one I'm referring to. Anyway, they weren't all that keen on young kids. You went in there to look at the new guitars. Well, they didn't want you to play them. No, you can't take it off the wall, and so on and so on. And they'd been like that for some time. They were catering to an older crowd, a jazzier crowd. And here comes blowing breath of fresh air. Come on in, kids. Sit down, have a chat, whatever. The little room in the back there. You can go back there and play guitar if you want. And I spent a lot of afternoons skipping school at Central Secondary in the back room of John Ballone's, woodshedding with the other young guys my age. And it was just, John cracked that code and has, like me, although the store's not closed, but guys like me that were supporters for the entire run of that store, because he just treated you well. The other really quick thing, I'll just take this because this is really important to his success, I believe. He was the first guy I ever saw, first music store I ever was aware of, where if you went in and bought an instrument and you wanted to upgrade, you could take that instrument back within a year, and he had provided you hadn't, damaged it. I'm talking about used stuff, but we didn't buy new stuff. Kids my age, we didn't buy it. But you could take it back, and he'd give you full value if you traded up to something else. So there were guys like me that made 5, 6, 8, 10 different trades over the course of a couple, 3 years, and worked their way up. And for a lot of guys, that's the only way they got the gear. You started with whatever you could afford, and then you took all the money you made and bought more, bought better. And John was right there every step of the way.
Yeah, and John Bellone is legend on the whole music scene in London for many, many years. I want to talk about the music scene in London in the 1960s. I understand there was a very vibrant scene. Of course, Robbie Robertson and the band and Garth Hudson of London were playing down in the East End at the Brass Rail, staying at nights at the Embassy Hotel. And downtown, there's a huge, vibrant scene going on. Largely forgotten and overlooked. What can you tell me about that, and why do you think that's happened?
Well, there were two elements to the scene. One was the bar scene, And I have a somewhere in my files, I have a newspaper page, the entertainment page from the Saturday paper. And as I recall, I haven't seen it for a while, but there were 16 live bands that weekend performing in London in restaurants, bars, whatever. Probably more because they didn't all necessarily advertise in the free press. But that I have to find that because I've seen it at 16 different places. So you've got, let's say for the sake of art, 15 or 20 bars. Probably half of them are open 6 nights a week. I mean, open with entertainment. They're all open, but open having entertainment. And probably half of them have, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Friday, Saturday, or some few would just have Saturday night. So you've got that very dynamic marketplace providing work for some Londoners, but a lot of those jobs went to traveling bands, particularly the 6 night a week job, because you got a band, you get it good enough that people want to see it, you get a good agent. There's 2 or 3 different circuits in this part of Canada. You get on one of those circuits and you work 52 years. So goes with the traveling guy. Now, 1963, I'm going to say, early 64, a couple people came to the area here, Roy Orbison being one of them, picked up a local band to go to tour, do a little mini tour with a band called Fortune Tellers, put them on the map, and other young bands looked at them at that point, because a lot of the young guys my age didn't know about the older, like as they said, that half a generation older guys. They didn't really know them. I'd been lucky enough to have some contacts with them anyway, but a lot of the young guys didn't know them at all. So to that point, and to me, because that really was my, we were looking at a whole new marketplace. We didn't want to play bars. To us, people who played bars, I don't want to say we're losers, but they'd given up. Right? They'd given up trying to become stars. Well, we wanted to be stars. We wanted to be rock and roll stars. So, although later I made a very good living playing bars for a number of years, but at that point in London, you wanted to be a rock and roll star, and in London that meant you had to practice a lot because there were some really dedicated bands in this town, and you had to play as much as you possibly could. And you always had your eye on the prize. Somewhere out there is a guy who's going to come along and discover us, and then we'll be big rock and roll stars, and all will be right with the world. Didn't work out that way for most of us, but it was still fun.
Great. Well, we want to come back and talk about that, but we have to take a short break. So just hang on, viewers. We'll be right back for more conversation with Jim Chapman. All right, we're back now with Jim Chapman. We're talking about the London music scene in the 1960s. Now, Jim, I've known you for years. I was on your program, your television program, your radio program, many, many times. It wasn't until recently I found out that you were a rock star in your own right with this band, the Bluesmen Revue, in the 1960s. You guys had a recording contract. You went to New York. You guys were the thing for a while. I didn't know that. I don't know how many other Londoners know about that. Can you fill us in?
Well, that was a very interesting story, a very interesting part of my life, the way all of that happened. I mean, I started off with a whole bunch of other guys, but all started from the same place with $75 guitars and homemade amplifiers. But a year or so went by. That's 1964. By 65, there really was a lot of work. I've got stuff in my scrapbook at home, a period there where there's, we played like 20 dates out of 25 days. Now that was in the summer, but 20 jobs in 25 days. There was so much work out there. And so that pushed everybody to work hard, get better. 66, by the Christmas of 66, there was just a booming market here, and all the little towns around here. This is an important part of the marketplace for playing. High schools, Keentown, Clinton, Exeter, and Aylmer, and Chatham, and all these places. They were all part of our scene too. So, 66, they have a battle of the bands. One of the local bookers, a guy named Bill Whitby, who was tremendously important to a lot of bands too. Bill was a booking agent, and he took he had all the best local bands and put on this battle of bands, 7 or 8 bands, at a place called the Windjammer Room that isn't there anymore. It used to be out near the London Gardens. Anyway, 1,200 people there, I think, on a Friday night, as I recall. All the local, the top local bands, all their big battle of the bands. The crowd votes for the band, so there's no judges or the people vote. Well, the Bluesmen won that and won it kind of handily. But we had, unlike most of the other bands, we were a full-time band at that point. That's all we did. And all the money we made after, giving mom and dad something for a place to sleep and food here and there, everything else went back into gear, buying better equipment. And we had a limousine. We traveled around in a limousine. We had a road crew. We had our own lighting system. We had custom built gear on stage. We had expensive board. We did all that stuff because we were looking beyond London. Right? We were looking at what the guys in Toronto would do. What do you have to do to be the top of the pile in Toronto? Well, in those days, you had to have all of that stuff. So we did all of that stuff. We practiced and practiced and practiced. And we had a management that started to bill us as Western Ontario's award-winning band, whatever that meant. But if they were, questioned about, well, they won the Battle of the Band, the big Battle of the Band, the biggest one that I'm aware of ever happened. Maybe after I was out of the scene might be different, but certainly back in those days, that was kind of the definitive moment. And not just for us, but for other bands there too, that proved that they were, we had bands in this town every bit as good as what was going on in Toronto. Not as many of them, but, and there were some great bands on that show. I'll forget somebody if I start rhyming them off, but.
Well, let me help you with that, Jim. There are a number of bands and musicians and singers that achieved great success. Of course, I mentioned already Garth Hudson and the band. They were playing in East London at the Brass Rail. Of course, we can't forget Guy Lombardo, and I think it's hard to remember how huge his band was at the time. They were worldwide. They were the band that would play on New Year's Eve from the Waldorf Astoria in New York. I mean, Londoners have achieved tremendous success. I want to spend our remaining time just kind of talking about some of those. I'm going to throw out a name, and you're going to give me a comment or a memory that you might have of them. But let me say this. The band you just mentioned that you were in, the Bluesmen Revue, I understand at some point you left them and you joined another band called Ocean. Ocean had a hit record, put your hand in the hand of the man. But I understand the sad part of that story is you left the band just before they hit it big. Is that true?
Yeah, it was great timing on my part. The band that was called Leather and Lace, and it was run by a London named Greg Brown, a wonderful keyboard player, and still a dear friend of mine. And we've had our moments over the years, but I have great respect and admiration for Greg. And he had this band called Leather and Lace. I had been living out west and came back here and was looking for a job. They needed a bass player. There you go. The band just gelled, and it was very, very good. But like, as happens a lot in the band business, people, your tastes change, your goals change, and it wasn't just me. The band really split up and then reformed into Ocean, but with some new people. But
Cool.
One of those things, at the time, who knew? And 4 months later, I'm playing in a bowling alley in Bay City, Michigan, and still working though. And went downtown to the local magazine store to see if they had billboard, which many of them, I don't know if they still do, but many of them did in those days. It's small town variety store, even there's billboard.
Yeah.
And I vividly remember flipping that rascal over. And they're number 2 in the world is Put Your Hand in the Hand. This like 4 months ago, that's what I was looking to do. But good for them. They had some success with that.
Yeah. Let's talk about Grant Smith and Sour as well.
Well,
they were a big band. Let me just hold that thought for a moment. They had a hit with a song called Keep On Running. Yeah. And then at some point the band reformed and some of the guys left the band and they created a little band called Motherload. Played one of my favorite songs of all time, And When I Die, I think it was called. A monster, huge hit, still one of my favorite songs to this very day. What do you know about that band?
Well, I didn't know them as well as I knew some of Grant's the other guys in the early versions of the Power. Kenny Marco, a friend of mine, I haven't seen him for a while. And Steve Kennedy and I are kind of how you doing? And Wayne Stone and I have been friends since we were teenagers. So, I knew 3 out of the 4 guys, but didn't have much to do with them because by the time they came along, I was out on the road full time and doing a different part of the business, working in a different part of the business. But you mentioned Grant's story is very interesting. Grant never really became. I don't want to step on his toes here. Grant didn't build his popularity in London as much as he did in Toronto and nationally. He became kind of a national star very quickly, and rightfully so. He's a great entertainer, and so he's one of those guys that basically as quick as he could, he got out of town. He went on the road. I think he was 17 or 18 at the time, underage, but those days there were ways around that. So he went to Toronto and had a band called The Express, and then the Power. But another guy had the Power. Eddie, somebody really can't remember his name. Doesn't matter. He had this band, the idea for this band, and then Grant brought it to fruition and put super players, got really good players. Jim Pauly from London, Wayne Stone from London, among them, and just a trend-setting, groundbreaking band for a big R&B horn band in Canada. They were the one. The Mandela, the Five Rogues of Mandela were, I think most musicians from that era would say they were the top Canadian band. And I'm not talking about the Guess Who and the Hollywood music guys. I'm talking about the real, stay at home and do it guys. I think the Five Rogues became the Mandela. They were probably the biggest one in that 5-piece band thing, and the Power was the big horn band.
Yeah, Jim, I grew up east of Adelaide. There was a drummer grew up not too far from me named Graham Lear.
Yeah.
I found out he went on to play with Santana for a number of years. Gino Vanelli, he does that amazing drum beginning introduction on People Gotta Move. He was with REO Speedwagon for a while. He's now with Paul Anka. Really a successful, world-renowned drummer. Did you ever run into him?
Oh yeah, Graham's a couple of years younger than I am, and he was. I mean, as far back as I can remember being interested in music, Graham was around. Great drummer. I remember the story was Graham was that his dad built him a practice room in the basement because he was driving his parents crazy because all he wanted to do was practice. So I never saw it, but I heard the story that he built that, and that's what he would do. He'd spend all his free time practice. Got to be, as you say, a world-class player. Graham and I played a New Year's gig in New Year's of 1965. So going into 66. We played a jazz gig, of all things, in a basement bar or something in Kitchener. How the memories fade after a while, but it was that was a fun. And I was not and am not much of a jazz player, but we managed to get through the night. That's the only time we were ever played together in the same band on stage. Right. We did shows together there. Yeah, that's great.
And so lots of other folks we could talk about, but we are running short on time. I'm thinking about Lighthouse with their London connections. Thunder Mug, of course, had that hit record with Africa, and Bill Durst and the band.
Back and listen to the stuff they recorded on that album. They were amazing.
Yeah. Jack Richardson, of course, a producer that basically helped the Guess Who become one of the number one bands in the world, the number one Canadian band at that time. And of course, I've already mentioned the band who played regularly at the Brass Rail in East London on Dundas Street. The list goes on and on. London has a great and rich musical tradition and history. You were part of the scene in the 1960s. Is there a future for music in London?
There's a future for music everywhere. The question is, what is that future going to be? We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. A lot of my friends who were working full time, what do? I was playing at least once a week for the year or so leading up to the COVID thing. I was in 4 different bands and had a single, and I was just having the time of my life. Retired, I'm playing all the time, all gone. What is going to happen in the future? I don't think anybody knows. I really don't. But Danny, can I ask you for a favor?
Yeah.
Can I do that? I just want to, because people watching this, I think might be really interested in this. This is Dick Williams' book. I don't know if you can see that or not. Dick
Yeah, I've
Williams,
read that book. It's fantastic.
our London audience, people who grew up in London, I believe if you just go on just look up Dick Williams on the internet, you'll find it there. Wonderful, wonderful book. And it talks about a lot of the radio side of the boom and the music boom in London. And Dick, of course, emceed a lot of the shows and ran a lot of dances and was just a huge part of the whole London in the 60s thing. So just a little plug for his book because it is very good.
Yeah, I'd love to do a show with him, but yeah, we're out of time now, Jim. It's been great to chat with you. Time flew by. I got to let you go. So I hope the viewers, have enjoyed this edition of London Lights. Stay tuned for another episode in 2 weeks, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Jim. Take care. Be safe.
Stay well, man.